The bell above the door of the daily grind was a liar. It didn't so much jingle as it did clank, a dull, uninspired sound that usually just blended into the background hiss of the espresso machine and the low murmur of conversations. But that afternoon, it clanked, and she walked in, and the entire soundscape of my life shifted on its axis. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of day that couldn't decide if it wanted to be autumn or winter, so it had settled on a miserable, persistent drizzle. I was huddled in my usual corner booth, pretending to work on blueprints that were going nowhere, nursing a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The place was my office, my sanctuary, my excuse for not being at my actual office. And then she came in, shaking a fuchsia umbrella that was far too cheerful for the weather. Raindrops flew from it like scattered diamonds under the warm lights. She had hair the color of dark honey, tied up in a messy knot that had given up the fight, and a constellation of freckles across her nose. She wasn't just pretty, she was vivid, like the world had been in grayscale and someone had suddenly turned on the color. She ordered a tea, something with a complicated name involving chamomile and lavender, and then proceeded to juggle it with a canvas tote bag overflowing with books and what looked like a half-eaten apple. The inevitable happened, of course. A thick hardback copy of 100 Years of Solitude made a bid for freedom, tumbling from the top of the pile. It landed with a thud right by my table. I was on my feet before I even thought about it, bending to pick it up. Our hands brushed as we both reached for it. It's a cliché, I know, the stuff of bad romantic comedies. But the jolt that went through me was anything but. It was warm and sharp, a tiny spark of static electricity that seemed to travel right up my arm and lodge itself in my chest. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice a little breathless. Her eyes were green, the color of moss after a rainstorm. "My bag is a public menace."
"Not at all," I managed, my own voice sounding foreign. I handed her the book. "A man could be taken out by a worse weapon than Marquez." A smile bloomed on her face, and that was it. That was the moment my world tilted. It wasn't a big, flashy grin, but a small, genuine curve of her lips that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "You're right. It would be a very literary way to go." She shifted her things to a small table near the window. "Thank you, Leo," I supplied, maybe a little too quickly. "Clara," she said, giving me that smile again. "Well, thank you, Leo. You've saved Gabriel Garcia Marquez from a very undignified end on a grimy coffee shop floor." She turned to her table, and I retreated to mine, my heart hammering a rhythm that was entirely new to me. I tried to go back to my blueprints, to the straight lines and calculated angles, but all I could see were moss-green eyes and a smile that felt like coming home. I stayed for another hour, pretending to work, but really I was just breathing the same air as her, stealing glances when I thought she wouldn't notice. When she finally packed up her chaotic bag and left, nodding a small goodbye in my direction, the clank of the bell on the door sounded like the loneliest sound I had ever heard. I didn't know if I would ever see her again, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had to.
I went back the next day, and the day after that. My corner booth became a permanent fixture, my blueprints a prop in a one-act play titled Man Casually Hoping for Lightning to Strike Twice. For 2 weeks, I haunted the daily grind. I drank enough mediocre coffee to float a battleship. I learned the baristas' names, their schedules, their shared dislike for the guy who always ordered a bone-dry cappuccino with 6 equals. I became part of the scenery, but there was no Clara. With every clank of that stupid bell, my head would snap up, a jolt of stupid, hopeful adrenaline firing through me, only to fade into the familiar ache of disappointment. I was starting to feel like a fool, like I'd completely imagined the charge in the air that day. Maybe she was just passing through. Maybe she'd found a better coffee shop, one with a bell that actually jingled. It was on a Friday, exactly 2 weeks after I'd first seen her, that I finally gave up. The drizzle outside had returned, a perfect, pathetic fallacy for my mood. I'd packed up my drawings, drained the last of a bitter Americano, and was shrugging on my coat. I'd just accepted it. It was a moment, a perfect little vignette that wasn't meant to have a second chapter. And then the bell clanked. I didn't even look up this time. What was the point? But then I heard a voice I'd been replaying in my head for 14 days, say, "Just a large peppermint tea, please." I froze, my arm halfway into my coat sleeve. I turned slowly, as if a sudden movement might shatter the mirage. But it was her. She was standing at the counter, her back to me, wearing a soft gray sweater that made her honey-colored hair seem even brighter. No chaotic tote bag this time, just a simple leather satchel. My heart was doing a drum solo against my ribs. My brain was screaming, "Don't just stand there, you idiot, say something, anything." She paid for her tea and turned, and for a terrifying second, her eyes swept right past me without a flicker of recognition. She started to head for that same table by the window. It was now or never. I took a breath and walked over, my feet feeling like they were encased in lead. "I was starting to worry," I said, my voice coming out a little hoarse. She stopped and looked at me, a polite but blank expression on her face, and then I saw it, the little spark of memory. Her brow furrowed, then cleared. A slow smile spread across her face. The one that made the whole ridiculous 2-week stakeout worth it. "Leo," she said, "the book rescuer." "The one and only," I said, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy. "I see you're traveling lighter today, less danger to the literary classics." She laughed, a sound that was even better than I remembered. "I learned my lesson. Today it's just one slim volume of poetry." She gestured to the empty chair at my table. "Are you just leaving?" "I was," I said, shrugging off my coat and draping it over the back of my old booth like I had never intended to go. But my plans just became incredibly flexible. We talked for 3 hours. I learned she was a grad student in comparative literature at the university uptown, that she hated cilantro, loved old black and white movies, and that her fuchsia umbrella had been a gift from her grandmother. I told her about being an architect, about how I loved the puzzle of fitting a person's life into a physical space, and how I was stuck on a project for a client who wanted a minimalist house but owned enough antique furniture to fill a museum. She listened, really listened, with an intensity that made me feel like I was the most fascinating person in the world. When the afternoon light began to fade, she glanced at her watch, and a little frown touched her lips. "I have to go," she said. "I have a seminar to teach." This was it, the moment of truth. My throat grew dry. "Clara," I said, and she paused, her moss-green eyes on me. "I don't suppose, I would really like to continue this conversation, maybe somewhere we're not paying by the cup?" Her smile returned, soft and a little shy this time. She reached into her satchel, pulled out a pen, and grabbed a napkin from the dispenser on the table. She scribbled something on it and pushed it across the table to me. It was her name and a 10-digit phone number. "Call me, Leo, the book rescuer." She gathered her things and walked to the door. Just before she left, she looked back and gave me a small wave. I sat there for a full 5 minutes just staring at the napkin, at the 10 digits that felt like a winning lottery ticket. And when I finally walked out into the cold afternoon air, the clank of the bell behind me was the sweetest music I had ever heard.
I clutched that napkin all the way back to my apartment like it was a winning lottery ticket. I laid it carefully on my drafting table, a flimsy piece of paper holding more potential than any blueprint I'd ever drawn. The age-old debate raged in my head: call her immediately and seem too eager, or wait the proverbial 3 days and seem coolly indifferent. The thought of playing games felt ridiculous. I wasn't coolly indifferent. I was the opposite of that. I was a bonfire of very interested. I waited until 8 o'clock that evening, a compromise I made with the imaginary panel of dating experts in my brain. I paced my living room floor for 10 minutes before finally dialing, my thumb hovering over the call button. My heart was thudding like a trapped bird. She answered on the second ring. "Hello?" "Hi, Clara. It's Leo." I cringed. Did I sound as nervous as I felt? "The book rescuer?" I heard the smile in her voice before she even spoke another word. "Leo, I was hoping you'd call." And just like that, the tension in my chest dissolved. We talked for a few minutes, the conversation easy and light, and I asked her if she was free Saturday. She was. I suggested a walk through the old historic district, the part of the city with the gas lamps and cobblestone streets. followed by dinner at a little Italian place I knew that had the best cacio e pepe on the planet. An architecture tour and pasta, she said. You're speaking my language. Saturday was one of those perfect, crisp autumn days. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air smelled of wood smoke and decaying leaves. I saw her before she saw me, waiting on the corner, her hands shoved into the pockets of a camel-colored coat, a bright red scarf wrapped around her neck. My breath caught in my throat. If our first conversation over coffee was a good first chapter, that walk was the whole novel. It turned out we were a perfect match of interests. I'd point out the detail on a cornice or the history of a particular brownstone's facade, and she'd tell me about the family that lived there 100 years ago, a story she'd gleaned from some obscure historical text she'd read for a class. We weren't just walking, we were building a world together, layering my bricks and mortar with her words and characters. Dinner was even better. The restaurant was tiny and loud and wonderful, dimly lit by candles stuck in old wine bottles. We talked about everything and nothing, our families, our worst jobs, our favorite lines from movies. I told her about my dream of one day designing a public library, a space that felt both grand and intimate. She told me about her thesis on the use of memory in post-war fiction and how she believed stories were the only real time machines we had. I watched the candlelight flicker in her moss-green eyes and felt a sense of rightness, a feeling so profound it was almost unnerving. This wasn't just a spark, it was a deep, resonant hum of connection. When I walked her to the door of her apartment building, a pre-war walk-up with a beautiful iron gate, we fell into that classic, awkward end-of-date silence. The air crackled with things unsaid. "I had a really wonderful time tonight, Leo," she said, her voice soft. "Me too," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. "More than wonderful." She looked up at me, a question in her eyes. And I knew I couldn't let this moment pass. I couldn't just say goodnight and walk away. I leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, but she didn't. She met me halfway. The kiss wasn't a sudden, fiery explosion. It was quiet and gentle and sure. It was a confirmation of everything I'd felt since the moment she'd walked into that coffee shop. It tasted of red wine and possibility. It felt like coming home. When we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine for a second. "Good night, Leo, the book rescuer," she whispered, her smile a pale curve in the dim light. She disappeared inside, and I walked 20 blocks back to my apartment without feeling the cold. I just kept replaying that kiss, that feeling of rightness. This wasn't just a crush. This was the beginning of something.
That first kiss wasn't an ending. It was the starting pistol for the rest of our lives. The weeks that followed were a blur of discovery. We became tourists in our own city and in each other's lives. Autumn bled into winter, the crisp air turning sharp and cold. But we barely noticed. We were generating our own heat. There were long Saturdays spent wandering through museums, our fingers laced together, whispering our own interpretations of the art. There were rainy Sundays spent in her apartment, a cozy nest filled with towering stacks of books and the scent of brewing tea. I'd lie on her worn Persian rug, my head in her lap, while she read poetry aloud, her voice rising and falling like music. I learned that she hummed when she was concentrating, that she bit her lip when she was trying not to laugh, and that she slept with one foot always outside the covers, no matter how cold it was. I took her to my studio, a place I rarely let anyone see. It was my sanctuary of organized chaos, covered in sketches, scraps of tracing paper, and architectural models that looked like the skeletons of future buildings. I was nervous, showing her this raw, unfinished part of myself. She walked through it with a quiet reverence, her fingertips ghosting over the edge of a blueprint. She looked at my plans for the minimalist house for the client with too much furniture. "He doesn't need less space," she said,
after a minute, looking at the drawings. "He needs smarter spaces, secret spaces. He wants to be a minimalist, but he loves his memories." She tapped a thick wall on the blueprint, like a library with hidden cabinets or a platform bed with deep storage drawers. I just stared at her. In 10 minutes, she had seen the core of the problem, the human puzzle I'd been struggling with for weeks. She saw the story behind the structure. It was in that moment, watching her trace the lines of a floor plan as if she were reading a poem, that I knew this was more than just falling for someone. I was seeing my life, my work, my entire world more clearly through her eyes. Our first real fight was over something laughably stupid. We decided to cook dinner together at my place. I'm a by-the-book cook. I follow a recipe with the same precision I used to design a support beam. Clara cooked like a jazz musician, a pinch of this, a splash of that, completely improvising. The result was a tomato sauce that ended up on the ceiling, a kitchen covered in a fine mist of flour, and 2 pans of burnt garlic bread. I got frustrated with the chaos, and she got quiet because she thought she'd failed. We stood in the smoke-filled kitchen, a mess of our own making surrounding us, and for a tense 5 minutes we didn't speak. Then her lips started to tremble, not with sadness, but with the effort of holding back a laugh. A giggle escaped, then another. I looked at the sauce dripping from the light fixture, at the flour dusting her eyebrows, and I started laughing too. We laughed until we were leaning against each other for support, all the tension gone, replaced by the pure, ridiculous joy of the moment. We ordered pizza and ate it on the floor, and it was the best meal I'd ever had. The night I first told her I loved her, it wasn't planned. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a Tuesday in December. A heavy snow was falling outside my apartment window, muffling the sound of the city into a soft hush. We were on my sofa, tucked over a wool blanket. She was reading, her head resting on my chest, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. I was just watching her, watching the way her eyes moved back and forth across the page, the way a loose strand of honey-colored hair fell across her cheek. A feeling of such profound peace and rightness washed over me that it was overwhelming. All the noise in my head, the constant low-grade anxiety of life was just gone. There was only the weight of her against me, the sound of her breathing, and the silent snow falling outside. "I love you," I said. The words just came out as easily and as naturally as breathing. They weren't a question or a declaration, they were just a statement of fact, like saying the sky is blue or the snow is cold. She stopped reading. She slowly lifted her head and took off her glasses, her moss-green eyes searching mine. There was no surprise in them, only a deep, gentle recognition. She put her hand on my cheek, her palm warm against my skin. She leant in and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss that said everything she didn't need to put into words. When she pulled back, she smiled, that smile that had wrecked me from the very first day. "I love you too, Leo."
2 years passed like a single beautiful season. Our lives, which had once run on parallel tracks, merged so completely that it became impossible to see the seams. My apartment became our home. Her books colonized my shelves, nestling between my heavy architectural tomes. My drafting pencil shared a cup with her favorite pens. We built a life in the small spaces, arguing playfully over who left the cap off the toothpaste, knowing exactly how the other took their coffee, and being able to communicate entire paragraphs with a single shared glance across a crowded room. Clara finished her dissertation. I was there in the audience when she defended it, my chest swelling with a pride that was so immense it felt like it was physically expanding my ribs. I watched her command the room with her quiet intelligence and fierce passion, and I saw her not just as the woman I loved, but as a force. I, in turn, finally cracked the code for my minimalist client using Clara's insight. The project was a success, and it led to more work, bigger projects. But the best part of any success was coming home and telling her about it. I knew I was going to marry her. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, dawning certainty that had been growing in me since she'd smiled at me over a fallen copy of Marquez. The knowledge was a part of my foundation now, the load-bearing wall of my entire world. The only question was how to ask. I thought about grand gestures, a trip to Paris, a fancy restaurant on a skyscraper rooftop, but none of it felt right. It wasn't us. Our story wasn't grand. It was real. It was built on small moments in ordinary places. And then I knew. It had to be where it started. I called Maria, the morning shift barista at the Daily Grind, who had witnessed my entire 2-week stakeout all those years ago. I explained the plan, and she shrieked with delight. A week later, on a Tuesday that was eerily similar to the first one, overcast with a hint of rain in the air, I asked Clara to meet me for coffee before we went to a movie. I told her I had to meet a contractor nearby, and it was a convenient spot. My heart was a jackhammer. My palms were sweating so much I was sure the small velvet box in my pocket was going to be water damaged. I got there early and sat in our old corner booth. The place hadn't changed. The same scuffed floor, the same smell of burnt coffee and steamed milk. Maria gave me a thumbs up from behind the counter. I just nodded, unable to form a smile. And then the bell clanked. She walked in, shaking a familiar-looking fuchsia umbrella. She smiled when she saw me, that same smile that still had the power to stop my world. It was a different woman from the one who had first walked in here, more confident, her hair now cut in a stylish bob, but she was also exactly the same. She was my Clara. She slid into the booth opposite me. "Hey, sorry I'm a little late. The subway was—" she started, but then she saw my face. "Leo? Are you okay? You look pale." I took a deep breath. "I'm fine. I was just thinking about the first time I saw you." I reached across the table and took her hands. "You walked in right through that door. You were juggling 1,000 things. You dropped the book." A soft, nostalgic smile touched her lips. "And you, Sir Galahad, rescued it." My life was like one of my blueprints before that day. It was all straight lines and right angles. It was functional, it made sense, but it was just black and white. There was no color. There was no life in the rooms yet. Her moss-green eyes were locked on mine, and I could see the understanding dawning in them. "You walked in and you were color, Clara," I continued, my thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You filled all the empty spaces. You are the life that fills the rooms. You make it a home." I slid out of the booth and knelt on the scuffed floor, ignoring the few other patrons who were now openly staring. I pulled the little velvet box from my pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple, vintage-styled ring with a small, perfect diamond. Her hands flew to her mouth and her eyes filled with tears, turning them into shimmering pools of green. "Clara," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "will you marry me?" For a moment, all I could hear was the hiss of the espresso machine and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then she nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she whispered a choked, "Yes. Oh, Leo, yes, of course, yes." I slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. A smattering of applause broke out in the little coffee shop. Maria let out a whoop from behind the counter. I stood up and pulled Clara into my arms, burying my face in her hair as she sobbed and laughed at the same time. When we finally left, walking out into the afternoon drizzle with her hand in mine, the ring sparkling on her finger, the bell above the door clanked its dull, uninspired clank, and I smiled. It had been a liar all along. It wasn't the sound of an ending or a beginning. It was the sound of everything. It was the sound of coming home.